Alright, so if you caught my live stream yesterday, you know that I have a new toy here. And I have a great bass clarinet. Of course, you probably don't recognize the term great bass clarinet because it's most commonly called a Contra-Alto Clarinet or an E-flat contrabass clarinet. So first thing I'm going to address is why I call it a great bass. So, linguistically, the term contra-alto actually doesn't make sense. I've addressed this in the video, the contra-alto conundrum. The term contra-alto, literally, if you break it down, means contralto. So it means against the high, which makes linguistically no sense. But we do have a term for an instrument that's bigger than the bass, but not the contrabass. So it's great bass. And by calling it a great bass, we acknowledge what it is, what it does, and it's an accepted term that dates back at least to the Renaissance era, if not even into the late medieval era. So it's a much more linguistically correct term. It also, by calling it a great bass, we differentiate it from the larger B-flat contrabass clarinet. So we have a great bass clarinet and a contrabass clarinet, and we're not going to confuse the two by having the name contrabass assigned to either one. So, what is a great bass clarinet? Well, it is an instrument pitched in E-flat. It is 1 octave below the alto clarinet. It's 2 octaves below the E-flat clarinet. This instrument is pitched 1/5 below the bass clarinet and 1/4 above the B-flat contra clarinet. Historically, a few were made in F. They were sometimes called contrabassett horns, and again, a linguistically dubious name. As far as we know, none of those instruments have survived. Only a couple were probably made 1890s, maybe in the very early years of the 1900s. So, the first contra clarinets were made in Prussia by the maker Wilhelm Wieprecht. Wieprecht is a super important figure in the wind band. And he gets overshadowed most times by the guy who stole every single one of his inventions, Adolf Sax. Wieprecht invented, along with his partner, Moritz, they invented the tuba and the contrabass clarinet. And what does Adolf Sax do? Steals their patents, says he makes improvements on them, and calls them sax horns. And then a few years later, he comes out with his own model of contra clarinet. Wieprecht's instrument was called the bathyphone, or bathyphone, B-A-T-H-Y-P-H-O-N-E. It was pitched in C. And it was able to play the bass lines. In fact, we have some surviving Wieprecht scores, because he was also a composer and a band leader, and you'll see the part bathyphone in. Adolf Sax, though, took that idea, and he made the first instrument in E-flat, the first known case where it was called a contrabass clarinet. And it was the Adolf Sax instrument from the 1850s. We have at least one photo of that instrument that still exists. It's not for certain if the instrument itself is still extant, but at least a photo of it. It was much more bassoon-like in shape than this. This design here is modeled, of course, after the bass clarinet, which was a development of Adolf Sax. That instrument did not see a lot of use in the 1800s. In fact, in all my years of research, I have discovered a single piece from the 1800s that uses the E-flat contra or great bass clarinet, and that is Camille Saint-Saëns' opera Henry VIII. And I am going to now play the entire corpus of the 18th or 19th century literature for the great bass clarinet. There you go. That's it. One single note, a low written E sounding G for, a held note. And that's the only note that is called for in the entire opera. Sasan in a later opera, and I'd have to remember which one it is, one of his very last operas from the early 1900s, calls for a B-flat contra clarinet in a much more important role. But after that, we don't see it used much. The B-flat instrument gets used a bit more, but even then, the B-flat instrument is a very, very rare beast. We move forward to about 1930, and the Selmer Company in Paris, who has taken over Adolphe Sax's workshop. So Selmer is basically the modern descendant of Adolphe Sax. They bought all of Sax's stuff and continued on, just changing the name of the company. They come out with their model of what they call the E-flat contrabass clarinet. And it comes out about 1930, and this is the famous rosewood instrument that is still in production today. The earliest ones were instruments that went down to low E, though there are some examples of low E flat instruments and even low D, and maybe a few rare examples of a low C sharp instrument, but never a low C instrument, oddly. The low C sharp would seem to be an odd choice until you realize that that low C sharp would be a concert E natural, which is the open string of the double bass. We don't see much literature for the E-flat contra clarinet in that time period. Why? Well, not a lot of those instruments are getting out of France. France gets occupied by the Nazis very soon thereafter. And at the same time in Paris, we have the LeBlanc company coming out with their B-flat contras. And that's in 1935. So within about 5 years, Selmer develops their instrument, LeBlanc develops theirs. Selmer focuses on E-flat, LeBlanc focuses on B-flat. They're both now being called contrabass clarinets, but they are a fourth apart from one another. World War II happens, and instruments don't come out of Paris there. And then we have to really wait until the 1950s for much more intensive production to start. And both companies, Selmer and LeBlanc, move some production to the United States and start focusing on student model instruments for younger bands. This is where we get the LeBlanc paper clips coming from, although they had been in development in Paris in the 1930s, but never in heavy production. They move those to America, they get produced much more. And then we've got this instrument here, which is a Selmer Bundy. It was at one time, this was originally marketed as the Bisher. So the very first ones that came out were marketed as Bisher, then they changed the name to Bundy, and finally in the last years of production it was Selmer USA. This is somewhat of a copy of the Selmer Rosewood. There are some differences. It does not come apart in the middle without taking a hex wrench to it. It can come apart, but it's only supposed to be done by an instrument repair techs. It has a short bell here instead of the tall Selmer Paris bell. Otherwise, it is pretty similar. There are some differences in bore. I don't believe Selmer Paris neck will fit on the Selmer USA. So, who starts using these? Well, Hollywood really gets into this. You will find that this instrument gets used quite a bit in Hollywood scores, starting in the late 50s and definitely into the 60s. This becomes a super popular instrument, particularly in TV scores. Why? Because the sound will transmit really well over the small TV speakers. You will hear this if you go listen to old Twilight Zone episodes, Star Trek the original series, a whole bunch of those really famous 1960s shows. If you listen down to that low woodwind section, you're going to be hearing the E-flat contra clarinet. Occasionally you might hear the B-flat, but they found that this instrument was so much easier to use and it gets you a lot of the notes you need. Band composers, of course, take to it, but by and large, band composers are writing a part either for B-flat or E-flat, and you just use whichever the player happens to have, and they're not writing independent parts for either one of them. So you can have one or the other. And a lot of times, it's just whatever the school happens to have. These particular instruments, this particular model was very popular in schools. It was relatively inexpensive, it was good quality, it lasted well. In fact, the high school that I taught at still has an original 1968-1969 Bisher model, and they only marketed it as a Bisher for 1 to maybe 3 years. So the very first production instruments are still in use, and that's getting close to 50 years. In fact, that is 50 years later. So the instruments hold up, they last a long time, and they're really pretty desirable. In fact, I even know professionals who use this very model of great bass clarinet. So let's talk about this particular instrument here, and this will be kind of a review of just the great bass clarinet itself. So if you are looking for a great bass clarinet, I do highly recommend looking at one of these Summer Bundy, Summer USA, or Bisher models. They all have the low E flat. You absolutely have to have an instrument with the low E flat. Otherwise, you are going to have tuning issues on the long B as well as low E. And it's not really just for range extension, it's for major tuning fixing in the middle range. There are some drawbacks to instruments this large. One of them is playing in the altissimo register is extremely difficult. There is no way to half hold this instrument. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play a chromatic scale from the lowest E flat, which sounds a concert G flat below the bass clef, and I'm going to go up as high as I can on this instrument. High C, so let's see how much higher I can go. And I think I'm having a leak somewhere. So as you see, the response up above high C really diminishes because I'm having to use all fake fingerings up there. Well, there's no such thing as a fake fingering, but alternative fingerings. So on a good day, I should be able to get up to about an F above the staff, if not a G. So that's a G. That would sound a B flat within the treble clef. So that's really pretty impressive range. So that's just over 3 octaves that this instrument can play. And again, I've only had this instrument less than a day, so that range will be probably expanded on and worked on. As a composer, I do love this voice. It's like just this big, enormous, deep cello. It's this rich voice, and when I include a part for the great bass clarinet, it's always in conjunction with the B-flat contrabass clarinet. And having the two instruments together just gives this solid, meaty bass sound that is really lacking in a lot of wind ensemble music. That said, it almost never appears in orchestral music. And I'm not sure why. It's an extremely versatile instrument. The B-flat contra is starting to make ingress into the orchestra, but the E-flat instrument, for whatever reason, is overlooked by a lot of composers, and there's probably a myriad of different reasons for that. They want the extra low notes. At some point, I would like to extend this instrument down to low C, which would sound the E-flat below the bass clef, and I would do that by basically putting a U bend here and have the next part come back up, and that'd be a real easy job with the 3D printer. But so yeah, it's a really overlooked instrument, but it is super versatile. In fact, players generally prefer playing on the E-flat great bass over the B-flat contrabass simply because it's more versatile. This upper register, the clarion, is super easy. It just speaks quickly. And on the B-flat instrument, no matter which kind of B-flat instrument, that's a very sluggish register. It doesn't work as cleanly. So if you want something more melodic in the upper register, this just belted out. Down below in the description, I'm going to link to a performance of my 3 songs for Contra-Alto Clarinet, or 3 songs for Great Bass Clarinet, that my good friend Joe Clark premiered several years ago back at the Eastman School of Music. And it's really a great performance, and it's a super lyrical piece that really treats the instrument in a melodic and important role, because so few composers have really taken this particular instrument seriously. I'd like to change that, because players like playing this instrument. It's versatile. It does a lot. I think with an eventual addition of a low C, it becomes even more versatile. And of course, once I finish building the great bassoon, have a nice double reed counterpart to this. So let me know, what do you think about the E-flat great bass clarinet, a.k.a. the Contra-Alto Clarinet, a.k.a. the E-flat contrabass clarinet? Have you used one? Do you play one? What pieces have you played it on? So let me know down in the comments down below. And as always, like, comment, subscribe, and big shout out to all of my Patreon supporters. They will all be linked in the end card. And until next time, I may do some more videos with this, and thanks for watching.